Player direction. If you've been playing AAA games in the past, 10-ish years, you've no doubt noticed the gradual transition into more clear signal markers for interactable objects. On the surface, this looks like a harmless addition to more clearly telegraph to the player the expressive range of their character at a given moment. I saw some talk about this in regards to Resident Evil 4 Remake, and I thought, hey, this is a flimsy enough pretense to justify making a video. So I made myself some coffee, and here we are. For RE4 Remake, if a crate has yellow paint on it, yellow because it's an unnatural color which is unlikely to show up in other areas, meaning it almost always stands out, if it has yellow paint on it, you know for certain you can interact with it. There are those who have grown tired of this setup, and I can't say I'm completely unsympathetic to their point of view, but no remedy I've ever heard has convincingly solved this problem without abandoning the photorealistic visual style. I'm not against that idea, but if the criticism of these yellow signal markers is that they look fake or gamey, I'm not sure exactly how revamping everything around them to look less realistic can be counted as a solution. The most important thing to understand when you transition from understanding games as a player to understanding them as a developer is that players do not intuit options they don't have. If a game does not have a jump function, players do not intuitively try to jump, and they probably don't think too hard about not being able to, provided the level design is principled enough to never throw an obstacle in the player's way which would easily be overcome with jumping. In that same vein, remember what I talked about when we talked about The Last Guardian? The player can climb on Trico, so to avoid the player dangling off of its crotch and characterizing the relationship between the boy and Trico as unwholesome, the developers just put a smooth skin patch on that area so that players don't question why they can't climb there. It's intuitive that they can't. The pillar dangling over Mono in Shadow of the Colossus was specifically placed there so that players didn't try to jump on top of her body and ruin the scene. Any complaint that a player has ever had about a game, like the yellow visual signposting for breakable items in the new Resident Evils, is almost certainly a complaint the developers had first. And when you use this sort of surface level analysis to try to remedy this stuff, what is always missing from the conversation is the unforeseen ramifications which the compromised setup we got almost certainly was a band-aid for. For the yellow crates, their function, and the function of the windows while we're here, is to be broken. There's no more information for these objects to parse out to the player, and if they had looked like regular house decorations, then it would add a layer of guesswork for the player, which doesn't flow well with Resident Evil 4's brand of hectic running around combat, and you also overly complicate the simple act of interacting with these crates. The original Resident Evil 4 did not need to signpost this hard, because the original RE4 was a GameCube game. Back then, they could just plop down those barrels and crates and that was that. They had different lighting from the rest of the environment and stood out, but those environments were also much emptier than what the photorealistic look requires. The shacks with crates in them had literally nothing else going on. If they'd have tried to design the remake like that, odds are the whole thing would just look off. The more photorealistic a game looks, the more care needs to be taken to actually make use of the space, and when developers have dedicated level clutterers to make the world seem lived in, they can't just plop a barrel down anymore and reasonably expect that players will be able to gravitate towards it in the middle of combat. Asking the players to expose themselves for the time it takes to break the crates and barrels and loot them without clearly letting the player know whether or not those objects are in fact interactable or is just visual clutter is not reasonable. The player needs to know for certain that what they are trying to break can in fact be broken. I get that the yellow X paint seems a bit excessive and that there are ways of doing this in a cleaner way. If regular decorations had more of a muted color scheme or was more submerged in shadows, then they could have visually distinguished this stuff by a color contrast. It does kind of grind against the whole photorealistic visual style though, and again, you could complain that this would also be immersion breaking. You could make those breakable objects be made from very specific materials and have a very different look from everything else in the environment. Again though, this might not be the best way to distinguish to players what is and is not interactable. If you've never actually done level design, you'd be surprised by how stupid and how smart players are simultaneously. Like, have you ever wondered why there's almost never important visual information above the player in a well-designed 3D game? It's because the camera is usually fixed on the horizon, and it's not intuitive to be looking upwards. and something being intuitive to interact with is much more important than it looking good. Good gameplay is always the chief concern. When you communicate clearly what is and is not interactable, players do not waste time and build up frustration interacting with environmental clutter which has no utility. Imagine a Sekiro where the grapple points weren't shown on the HUD, and you're imagining a Sekiro which requires a lot more guesswork from the players or a fundamental rethink from the developers in order to clearly communicate grapple points, and that might very easily ruin the visual design. Players would also be punished much harsher for exploring, since the signposting wouldn't be there to guide them, so that whole aspect of the game would have been diminished as well. And if you think asking the players to interact with it in a natural-looking way is an improvement in spite of this, you need to consider game direction. The hard signposting allows players to scan areas much faster, and it also allows level designers to guide the player's eyes, because just plopping down a clearly marked interactable object in the distance guarantees to the player that that path is navigatable. If the crates and barrels just looked like regular crates or barrels, there would probably be more times where players would miss those on the other side of the map and would be unable to intuit the options they have in the fight area, which is going to feel pretty bad when the player is running around with a horde of enemies behind them, and they need to put together a plan of action in a split second. Suffice it to say, this kind of hard signposting helps with the mood of the action. They are not trying to make a world that looks real, they are creating a world whose visual language communicates the important information in harmony with the mood which is supposed to be set, and with how the player is meant to navigate the spaces. These boxes are not here to look realistic, they are there to add a moment of decision-making and randomness to looting. When you're running around and are low on ammo, you can risk the extra time it takes to break those crates to loot them. But because the loot is inside the crates, you don't know what it is, if it is anything at all. The reason we have some items in crates instead of every item being plopped down in the overworld is not just so that the developers can look at the player's resources and sneak some extra goodies in there for them if they're struggling, it's also to add a layer of ambiguity to the fast-paced mid-combat scavenging. There are items plopped down which the player can only really see because of the pick-up button prompt they get when they go near them, and while I like them because they can make for those glorious yes moments where you just stumble upon exactly what you need, if this was the basic mode of looting instead of every now and then happy exceptions, and the clearly telegraphed breakable objects were removed, my guess is that the action would come through a much more sacky. It would have a much more scattered feeling, and players would probably not take well to how much of their navigation is in search of a lucky piece of loot, rather than them making a beeline for a crate they saw earlier. I've seen the pitch that the signposting issue, quote-unquote, could be solved by having higher difficulties not include them, which I think is a really bad idea, which doesn't quite get at why this is done. I repeat myself, but game direction. Difficulty options which just remove gameplay directions from the player and make decision-making more arbitrarily limited, which make the navigation of the environments in combat more unintuitive, is not good difficulty options, because you haven't made the core game more difficult, you've just removed that valuable player direction tool which helped so much in setting the mood of the game's combat, and you've replaced it with frustrating guesswork. We might as well just have Leon go to sleep every now and then, because of the parasites inside of him as a difficulty mode, because, yeah, it does make the game harder when you can't control your character in the middle of a fight, but it does not at all congeal well with the intended experience. Playtesting almost certainly bore out that the setup the game ended up having was the best compromise. Resident Evil 4 could have been a hardcore survival horror game, one where exploration is explicitly the point, and where there's so much ambient quiet time to set the tone that removing the signposting might have been a better go. If this game was about slow, methodical exploration in a strange land or something, I can see the argument for kicking the crutch from under the player and letting them spend time immersing themselves in the world by interacting with it in this way, letting the player shoulder the burden of setting the tone. But that's just not what this game is. And for the kind of game that this is, playtesting almost certainly bore out that the yellow X's were the best way to go. Maybe players weren't seeing the crates, maybe they were trying to interact with too much stuff, maybe they never bothered interacting with anything in combat because there's so much clutter, which all looked the same. Whatever it is, I guarantee that this visual signposting came about because the alternative did not play as well. The idea that the game world looking more realistic is a worthwhile compromise for the gameplay not intuitively expressing the intended mood of combat or exploration It's ridiculous. Imperfect solutions to game direction problems is also why characters in games will oftentimes just straight up narrate to the players what they need to do next. I generally don't like when characters do that, and in almost every case of it, I think that tighter game direction would have been preferred, but in the absence of tighter game direction, I'm fine with just letting the characters talk. And in the absence of a better solution to our crate problem, I'm fine with the yellow X. It's not like Resident Evil 4 is a game about being lost in the world or anything. From the demo, it does not seem to have mechanics to facilitate that sort of experience, nor does it have the world design to prop it up, assuming it follows the world design of the original Resident Evil 4. The original was a rollicky cinematic action game, and the remake looks like it's going to be a cinematic survival action game, ? And for that mood to be disturbed for the sake of the game looking more realistic, or whatever, that's actually a bad thing. The yellow tape on the windows, I think, is actually a bit more egregious than what we see with the crates, but I can see where the developers might have been coming from. First of all, I'm not sure if all the windows in the game are breakable, and if not, then it might have been warranted clearly distinguishing which windows can and cannot be broken. I also wonder if this is a case of them having set up a clear visual signpost for interactable environmental clutter, and that once playtesters began to read the world looking for those, they maybe did not intuitively understand to interact with windows because they did not have the yellow markings. Maybe it's just a case of them being overly conservative, I don't know. I don't have any of their playtesting information, I'm just theorizing here. For the button prompts, which hover over all of our interactions, I'm of two minds. This is an action game, so players should really know how to perform an attack to break the crates or jump through the windows, but I guess having the button eliminates guesswork, which can save the player's life in the middle of combat when they are trying to quickly pick something up and they need to know if they're actually in the vicinity for picking those items up or not. The reason this couldn't have been placed above every interactable object, and the objects themselves had been made more aesthetically in line with the rest of the game's clutter, is because the vicinity for the button prompts has a low range in order to not bloat the screen with HUD elements, which would have undoubtedly been much more offensive looking than the yellow signposted ended up being. I talked a bit about how the uncrated items, the items plopped down in the world itself, can make for wonderful little yes moments where the player stumbles upon something they desperately needed, which is wonderful as an addition to the more signposted lootable objects, but the idea of the button prompts themselves is interesting. I already talked about how locking the interaction behind a clearly communicated button prompt can save the player some precious microseconds of adjusting themselves to jump out of a window or push a cabinet or loot or what have you. If this game had a fixed camera, I think level design alone could have gotten the job done of telegraphing these interactions to the players by itself. But because the game doesn't, and because there's not enough time in the world to design the levels in such a way that the player's eyes will almost always gravitate towards points of focus, since the player is usually more concerned with the trail of enemies behind them, the floating button prompt I think is a reasonable compromise. It also makes sure that the players don't waste time trying to pick up non-items, and that's pretty cool too. Ultimately, I think this signposting conversation is a lot like the frame rate conversation, where the more the game is about the player quickly parsing through challenges presented visually, the more information they have, the better. Resident Evil 1 did not need to do this, but the granddaddy of survival horror moved at a glacial pace compared to its edgier, more action-packed grandchild. Or, like the remake of its grandchild. Resident Evil 1 could have played with 8 frames per second, and it would not significantly alter the game. It had snap auto-aiming, it had camera angles which highlighted loot in areas, it had very slow enemies. RE4 Remake requires the high frame rate because enemies are fast and aiming is manual. And it needs hard signposting because the camera is in the player's hands, and they optimize its utility for visual information, not for environmental highlighting. It is not cool to ask the player to dedicate the camera to searching for lootable items in a game whose action moves this fast. Speaking of fast, boy, this video really flew by, huh? I imagine that you've been around the block a few times, and that I don't personally need to signpost the call to actions here at the end. Subscribing, liking, commenting, and all that jazz. But I do have some other short, snappy videos in the same-ish vein as this one, which you might enjoy. There is one about gamifying nostalgia, one is about interfaces, which is relevant to the topic here, and another one explores the evolution of Resident Evil's presentation of flesh and the danger. All of those are linked below for you if you want to check them out. Special thanks to the patrons who help me make videos like this one happen. Very cool of you patrons. I love you all very much. I'm AesirAesthetics. See you in the next video.